The Capuchin catacombs of Palermo were silent, as they had been for centuries. The air was thick with the weight of history, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets of the dead. Among the thousands of mummified bodies lining the corridors, one stood out, a young girl named Rosemary. She lay in a glass coffin, her hands folded neatly over her chest, her face so perfectly preserved it seemed as though she were only sleeping. But Rosemary had been dead for over 100 years. Visitors came from all over the world to see her. Some were drawn by the scientific marvel of her preservation, while others were lured by the chilling legends that surrounded her. It was said that every night, long after the catacombs closed to the public, Rosemary's eyes would open. No one could explain how or why, but the stories persisted, passed down through generations like a dark fairy tale. One evening, as the last of the tourists filed out of the catacombs, a young historian named David lingered behind. He had spent years studying Rosemary's case, fascinated by the mystery of her preservation. The caretakers, used to his presence, allowed him to stay a little longer. David approached the glass coffin, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. He stared at Rosemary's face, searching for any sign of the phenomenon he had heard so much about. "It's impossible," he muttered to himself. "Eyes don't just open on their own after death." But as the words left his mouth, a cold draft swept through the corridor, extinguishing his flashlight. For a moment, there was complete darkness. Then a faint glow emanated from the coffin. David's breath caught in his throat as he watched Rosemary's eyelids flutter, and then slowly open. Her eyes were a deep, haunting blue, and they seemed to stare directly into his soul. David stumbled back, his heart pounding. This wasn't supposed to happen, it couldn't be real. But there she was, looking at him as if she had been waiting for him all along. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, snapping David out of his trance. He turned toward the noise, but the corridor was empty. When he looked back at the coffin, Rosemary's eyes were closed again, her face as peaceful as ever. Had he imagined it? Or had something truly supernatural just occurred? David didn't have time to think. The caretakers were coming to lock up for the night, and he knew he had to leave. But as he hurried out of the catacombs, one thought consumed him. He had to uncover the truth about Rosemary. What was she trying to tell him, and why had she chosen him to witness her secret? David couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosemary's piercing blue stare. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her eyes open, it was the way she had looked at him, as if she knew him, as if she had been waiting for him to come. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions. Was it a trick of the light, a hallucination, or something far more unsettling? By dawn, David was back at the catacombs, determined to find answers. The caretakers, accustomed to his frequent visits, let him in without question. He made his way to Rosemary's coffin, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. David knelt beside the glass coffin, studying Rosemary's face. She looked exactly as she had the night before, peaceful, serene, and utterly lifeless. But something felt different. The air around her coffin was colder, and the shadows seemed to gather closer, as if they were watching him. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of research he had compiled over the years. Rosemary had died in 1910, just 2 years old, from an unknown illness. Her father, a wealthy merchant, had paid a fortune to have her body preserved using a secret embalming technique. The process had been so effective that her skin remained soft, her features untouched by decay. But no one had ever been able to explain how, or why, her eyes were said to open at night. As David scribbled down his observations, he noticed something strange. The shadows around the coffin seemed to shift, forming shapes that almost looked like words. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The shadows twisted again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the letters H-E-L-P etched into the darkness. He jerked back, his heart racing. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Shadows don't spell words. I'm losing it." But the shadows didn't stop. They continued to move, swirling around the coffin like a living mist. David's instinct screamed at him to leave, but his curiosity held him in place. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the glass of the coffin. The moment his fingers made contact, a sharp, icy pain shot through his arm. He yanked his hand back, gasping. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. For a moment, he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness receded, leaving him standing alone in the corridor. But he wasn't alone. Rosemary's eyes were open again, and this time, her lips were moving. No sound came out, but David could read the words on her lips. "Find me." David's legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A trick of his exhausted mind? Or was Rosemary truly trying to communicate with him from beyond the grave? Before he could gather his thoughts, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. David scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. The caretakers were coming, and he knew he couldn't let them see him like this. He glanced back at the coffin one last time. Rosemary's eyes were closed again, her face as still as death. But the shadows around her coffin continued to twist and writhe, as if they were alive and waiting. David spent the rest of the day in a daze. He couldn't shake the image of Rosemary's lips forming the words, "Find me." What did it mean? Was she trapped somewhere? Was her spirit unable to move on? The questions gnawed at him, but he had no answers. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore what he had seen. He had to dig deeper. That evening, David returned to his small apartment, which was cluttered with books, papers, and artifacts from his research. He pored over every document he had on Rosemary, searching for something, anything that could explain the strange phenomena surrounding her. But the more he read, the more frustrated he became. The records were incomplete, filled with gaps and contradictions. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something he had overlooked before. Tucked inside an old, dusty book about the history of the Capuchin catacombs was a folded piece of paper. David carefully unfolded it, his hands trembling with anticipation. It was a letter written in elegant flowing script. The date at the top read, October 12, 1910, just days after Rosemary's death. The letter was from Rosemary's father, addressed to the embalmer who had preserved her body. David's eyes scanned the page, his heart pounding as he read, "I beg of you, do whatever it takes to keep her with me. I cannot bear to let her go. Use the ancient methods, the ones you spoke of. I care not for the cost or the consequences. She must remain as she is forever." David's breath caught in his throat. Ancient methods? What did that mean? He flipped through the book, searching for more clues, but there was nothing. Frustrated, he slammed the book shut and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Then a thought struck him. What if Rosemary's father had left behind more than just a letter? What if there was a diary or a journal that documented the process of her preservation? It was a long shot, but David knew he had to try. The next morning, David returned to the catacombs, determined to find answers. He approached one of the older caretakers, a man named Giuseppe, who had worked there for decades. Giuseppe was a quiet, reserved man, but he had always been kind to David. "Giuseppe," David said, keeping his voice low, "do you know if Rosemary's family left anything behind? A diary, perhaps? Anything that might explain how she was preserved?" Giuseppe hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied David. For a moment, David thought the old man would refuse to answer, but then Giuseppe sighed and nodded. "There is a box," he said slowly. "In the archives. It belonged to her father. No one has opened it in years, but—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. "But what?" David pressed. Giuseppe leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "They say the box is cursed, that anyone who opens it will suffer the same fate as Rosemary." David's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'll take my chances," he said firmly. "Can you show me where it is?" Giuseppe hesitated again, then nodded. He led David to a small, dusty room deep within the catacombs. The room was filled with old boxes and crates, each one labeled with a name and date. Giuseppe pointed to a small, unassuming wooden box in the corner. "That's it," he said. "But be careful, David. Some things are better left buried." David nodded, his heart pounding as he approached the box. It was smaller than he had expected, with intricate carvings on the lid. He knelt down and carefully lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and a small, leather-bound diary. His hands trembled as he picked up the diary and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letter, Rosemary's father's. The first entry was dated September 30th, 1910, just days before Rosemary's death. David began to read, his eyes widening with each word. The diary detailed the desperate measures Rosemary's father had taken to preserve her body, including the use of an ancient forbidden embalming technique. But as David read on, he realized there was more to the story, much more. The final entry, dated October 15th, 1910, sent a chill down his spine. "I have done what I must to keep her with me, but now I fear I have made a terrible mistake. She is not at peace. She is trapped, and I cannot free her. God forgive me." David closed the diary, his mind reeling. Rosemary's father had done something unspeakable to preserve her body, and now her spirit was trapped, unable to move on. But what had he done? And how could David help her? As he sat there staring at the diary, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The shadows around him began to twist and writhe, just as they had around Rosemary's coffin. And then he heard it, a faint whispering voice, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. "Find me." David's hand shook as he clutched the diary. The whispering voice lingered in his ears, sending a chill down his spine. He glanced around the dimly lit archive room, half expecting to see Rosemary standing there. But the room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. He flipped through the diary again, searching for more clues. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to an ancient ritual Rosemary's father had used to preserve her body. David's heart raced as he pieced together the details. The ritual involved a combination of rare herbs, sacred oils, and incantations passed down through generations. But there was something else, something dark and forbidden. The final entry mentioned a binding spell, a way to tether Rosemary's soul to her body, ensuring she would never decay. But the spell came at a cost. It required a sacrifice, something her father had failed to mention in his earlier writings. David's stomach churned as he realized the truth. Rosemary's father had not just preserved her body, he had trapped her soul, condemning her to an eternity of unrest. David closed the diary, his mind racing. He had to find out more about this ritual. If he could understand how it worked, maybe he could reverse it and set Rosemary free. But where could he find such information? The diary was vague, and the catacombs' archives held no further clues. As he sat there, lost in thought, Giuseppe's warning echoed in his mind. Some things are better left buried. But David couldn't let it go. He had seen Rosemary's eyes open, heard her whisper. She was real, and she needed his help. Determined, David left the catacombs and headed to the local library. If anyone had information on ancient rituals, it would be there. The library was a grand old building with towering shelves and a musty smell. David spent hours combing through books on folklore, mythology, and occult practices. Finally, in a dusty, forgotten corner, he found what he was looking for, a book titled Ancient Rites and Forbidden Rituals. The book was old, its pages brittle and yellowed. David carefully flipped through it, his heart pounding as he found a chapter on binding spells. The description matched what Rosemary's father had written in his diary. The ritual required a lock of the deceased's hair, a vial of their blood, and a personal item of great significance. These items were to be placed in a sacred circle, along with the herbs and oils, while the incantation was recited. But there was a warning at the end of the chapter written in bold red letters. The binding spell is irreversible. Once cast, the soul cannot be freed. To attempt to undo the spell is to invite disaster. David's hands trembled as he read the words. If the spell was truly irreversible, then Rosemary was trapped forever. But he couldn't accept that. There had to be a way to break the spell, to set her free. He just needed to find it. As he left the library, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. David felt a sense of urgency building within him. He needed to act fast. But first he had to gather the items mentioned in the ritual. A lock of Rosemary's hair, a vial of her blood, and a personal item. The thought of taking these from her coffin made his stomach turn, but he had no choice. That night, David returned to the catacombs. The caretakers were gone, and the corridors were eerily silent. He made his way to Rosemary's coffin, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. The shadows seemed to follow him, twisting and writhing as if alive. When he reached the coffin, he hesitated. The glass lid was cold to the touch, and Rosemary's face looked so peaceful, so lifelike. He took a deep breath and carefully lifted the lid. The air around him grew colder, and he felt a presence, something watching him. He reached into the coffin, his hands trembling as he took a small pair of scissors from his pocket. He carefully snipped a lock of Rosemary's hair, his heart pounding with every movement. Next, he took a small vial and pressed it to her wrist, collecting a few drops of blood. Finally, he noticed a small locket around her neck. It was delicate, with a tiny rose engraved on the front. He gently removed it, feeling a strange sense of guilt. As he closed the coffin lid, the shadows around him surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. He heard a faint whisper, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. "Thank you." David's heart raced as he stumbled back, clutching the items tightly. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but he couldn't turn back now. He had the pieces of the ritual. Now he just needed to figure out how to use them to set Rosemary free. David returned to his apartment, the items from Rosemary's coffin clutched tightly in his hands. The lock of hair, the vial of blood, and the locket felt heavy, as if they carried the weight of her trapped soul. He spread them out on his desk, staring at them as if they might reveal their secrets on their own. The book from the library lay open beside them, its pages filled with cryptic instructions and dire warnings. The ritual to reverse the binding spell was complex and dangerous. It required creating a sacred circle, placing the items within it, and reciting an incantation under the light of a full moon. But there was a catch. The ritual had to be performed in the exact location where the original spell was cast. For David, that meant returning to the catacombs, to the very spot where Rosemary's father had performed the forbidden ritual over a century ago. David's hands trembled as he gathered the necessary supplies: candles, herbs, and a piece of chalk to draw the circle. He knew he was playing with forces he didn't fully understand, but he couldn't turn back now. Rosemary's whisper, "Thank you," still echoed in his mind, urging him forward. That night, under the pale glow of the full moon, David returned to the catacombs. The caretakers were gone, and the corridors were silent, save for the faint rustling of shadows. He made his way to Rosemary's coffin, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to close in around him, as if they were alive and watching. When he reached the coffin, he set his supplies down and began to draw the sacred circle on the stone floor. The chalk lines glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the air within the circle seemed to hum with energy. David placed the lock of hair, the vial of blood, and the locket in the center, arranging them carefully as the book had instructed. He lit the candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The herbs burned slowly, filling the air with a sweet, smoky scent. David took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he prepared to recite the incantation. The words were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but their power was undeniable. As he began to speak, the shadows around him surged forward, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew colder and the candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in the darkness. David's voice trembled as he continued the incantation, each word feeling heavier than the last. Suddenly the ground beneath him began to shake and the walls of the catacombs seemed to close in. The shadows within the circle began to swirl, forming a vortex of darkness. David's heart raced as he realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The incantation wasn't just reversing the binding spell, it was awakening something far more powerful. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the circle and pulling David into their depths. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him dissolved into darkness, and he felt himself falling into an endless void. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the catacombs. He stood in a vast, shadowy landscape, the ground beneath him cracked and barren. The sky above was a swirling mass of black clouds, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. In the distance, he saw a figure, a young girl with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. Rosemary. She stood there, her expression filled with sorrow and longing. David tried to call out to her, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, and whispered a single word. Help. David's heart ached as he realized the truth. The ritual had pulled him into the shadow realm, a place between life and death, where Rosemary's soul was trapped. But he wasn't alone. The shadows around him began to take shape, forming grotesque, twisted figures that reached for him with clawed hands. He had to find a way to free Rosemary and escape this place before the shadows consumed them both. But how? The incantation had failed, and he was trapped in a realm where the rules of the living no longer applied. As the shadowy figures closed in, David clenched his fists and took a step forward. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't give up. Rosemary's soul depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to set her free, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. The Shadow Realm was a place of nightmares. The ground beneath David's feet was cracked and dry, and the air was thick with a suffocating darkness. The twisted figures around him hissed and snarled, their glowing eyes fixed on him as they closed in. David's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think. He had to find a way out. Rosemary stood a few feet away, her small figure trembling as she reached out to him. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. Help me. David took a step toward her, but the shadowy figures moved faster, blocking his path. They were formless, yet menacing, their shapes shifting and writhing like smoke. David clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no weapons, no tools, just his wits and his determination. "Rosemary," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast, empty landscape. "I'm here to help you, but you have to trust me." The girl's eyes widened and she nodded slowly. She pointed to the ground beneath her feet, where a faint, glowing symbol was etched into the cracked earth. David recognized it immediately. It was the same symbol from the book, the one that represented the binding spell. The shadows around him surged forward, their clawed hands reaching for him. David ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding their grasp. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward Rosemary, the shadowy figures hot on his heels. As he reached her, he noticed something strange. The symbol on the ground was glowing brighter, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. "What do I do?" David asked, his voice desperate. Rosemary pointed to the locket he still clutched in his hand. "Break it," she whispered. "Break the chain." David didn't hesitate. He snapped the delicate chain of the locket, and the moment it broke, the symbol on the ground flared with blinding light. The shadowy figures shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The ground beneath David's feet began to shake, and the air around him grew colder. Rosemary's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him. "Thank you," she whispered. "But you have to go. Now." David shook his head. "I'm not leaving without you." But Rosemary's form was already fading, her body dissolving into light. The symbol on the ground began to crack, and the shadow realm started to collapse around them. David felt a powerful force pulling him backward, dragging him away from Rosemary and back toward the world of the living. "No!" he shouted, reaching out to her. "I can't leave you here." But it was too late. The light engulfed him, and the shadow realm dissolved into nothingness. When David opened his eyes, he was back in the catacombs, lying on the cold stone floor. The candles had burned out and the sacred circle was gone. The lock of hair, the vial of blood, and the broken locket lay scattered around him, their power spent. David sat up, his head spinning. The air around him was still and silent, and the shadows no longer twisted or writhed. He looked toward Rosemary's coffin, his heart pounding. The glass lid was open, and the coffin was empty. David's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled to his feet and approached the coffin, his hands trembling. Where was she? Had the ritual worked? Or had he made things worse? As he stared into the empty coffin, he felt a cold draft sweep through the corridor. The shadows around him shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a faint, glowing figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was Rosemary, her form translucent and ethereal. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she faded into the darkness. David's legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know if he had truly set her free or if he had only made things worse. But one thing was certain. The mystery of Rosemary's preserved body would haunt him for the rest of his life. Days turned into weeks, and David couldn't shake the memory of what had happened in the catacombs. The empty coffin, the glowing figure of Rosemary, the shadow realm, it all played on a loop in his mind. He spent hours poring over the diary and the book of ancient rituals, searching for answers. But the more he read, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The catacombs had changed since that night. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. Visitors still came to see the mummified bodies, but Rosemary's coffin remained empty, a silent reminder of the mystery that had captivated so many. The caretakers avoided the subject, and Giuseppe refused to speak of it at all. David tried to move on, to focus on his work, but he couldn't. He felt a lingering connection to Rosemary, as if her presence still lingered in the corners of his mind. He often found himself wandering the catacombs late at night, drawn to the spot where he had performed the ritual. The shadows no longer twisted or writhed, but he could still feel their presence, watching him. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, he noticed something strange. The broken locket he had taken from Rosemary's coffin was glowing faintly, its delicate rose engraving shimmering in the dim light. David picked it up, his heart racing. The metal was warm to the touch, and as he held it, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. He didn't know how or why, but he knew Rosemary was finally free. The ritual had worked, and her soul had moved on. The locket was a reminder of her gratitude, a symbol of the bond they had shared in those fleeting moments in the shadow realm. David placed the locket on his desk, next to the diary and the book of ancient rituals. He knew he would never fully understand what had happened, but he had made his peace with it. Rosemary's story was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a testament to the power of love, loss, and the lengths people would go to hold on to those they cherished. As he sat there, staring at the locket, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The shadows shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a faint glowing figure standing in the corner. It was Rosemary, her form translucent and ethereal. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she faded into the darkness. David smiled back, a sense of closure washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Rosemary's story would stay with him forever, a haunting reminder of the thin line between life and death and the mysteries that lie beyond.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.